millionaire detective, a mystery tangled in 6 languages, and a woman no one expected to become the key to everything. What she says in the next 5 minutes will decide the future of the entire case. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn rain fell in steady sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets, turning the gas-lit avenues into rivers of amber light and shadow. It was October of 1902, and the city hummed with the energy of a new century still finding its stride. Detective Alexander Hartford stood at the window of his Beacon Hill townhouse, watching the downpour obscure the view of the common below. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the Persian rug, his strong shoulders tense beneath his tailored waistcoat. At 32, he had built a reputation as one of Boston's most brilliant private investigators, a man whose inherited wealth allowed him to choose cases based on intrigue rather than necessity. But tonight, Alexander felt the weight of frustration pressing against his temples. On his mahogany desk lay a collection of letters, each written in a different language he could not decipher. They had arrived over the past week, all connected to his current case involving the disappearance of valuable artifacts from the Museum of Fine Arts. The letters were addressed to various suspects, and Alexander knew they held the key to unraveling the mystery. Yet without a translator, they might as well have been written in invisible ink. He had tried hiring translators from the university, but each specialized in only 1 or 2 languages. The letters before him were written in French, Italian, German, Russian, Portuguese, and what appeared to be Polish. Finding 6 different translators, coordinating their schedules, and maintaining the confidentiality his wealthy clients demanded had proven impossible. Alexander ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture of rare vulnerability for a man known for his composed demeanor. His housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, had suggested something unusual that morning. Her niece knew of a young woman, recently arrived from Europe, who possessed an extraordinary gift for languages. The woman was currently working as a nanny for a family in the South End, but Mrs. Dawson believed she might be persuaded to take on additional work. Alexander had initially dismissed the idea. A nanny? What could a woman who spent her days minding children possibly offer to a complex criminal investigation? Yet desperation had a way of opening closed minds. By late afternoon, Alexander found himself composing a letter to Miss Genevieve Rousseau, care of the Blackwell residence on Warren Avenue. He explained in carefully measured terms that he required assistance with translation for a matter of utmost discretion. He offered generous compensation and promised that the work could be completed in the evenings, after her regular duties concluded. He sealed the letter with his family crest, a Hartford symbol that carried weight in Boston society, and dispatched it with his driver. The response arrived before the evening meal. Miss Rousseau's handwriting was elegant, flowing across the cream-colored paper with the confidence of someone well-educated. She agreed to meet with him the following day, Sunday afternoon, when her employers traditionally gave her time for personal matters. She suggested they meet at the Boston Public Library, a neutral location that would preserve propriety. Alexander found himself studying her handwriting, noting the slight European flourish in her capital letters, wondering what sort of woman would possess such linguistic talents. Sunday arrived with clearing skies and crisp autumn air. Alexander dressed with particular care, choosing a charcoal gray suit and burgundy cravat. He told himself this attention to appearance was simply professional courtesy, nothing more. The library's grand facade welcomed him as his automobile pulled to the curb. The vehicle, a gleaming black Ford Model A, drew admiring glances from pedestrians. Alexander preferred his automobile to horses for city travel, though he kept a fine stable at his country estate for riding. Inside the library's magnificent reading room, Alexander settled at a corner table, arranging the mysterious letters in a leather portfolio. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air. He checked his pocket watch, a gold piece inherited from his father. 3 o'clock precisely. He had requested she arrive at 3:15, giving himself time to observe her entrance. At exactly 3:14, a young woman appeared at the reading room entrance. Alexander's breath caught unexpectedly. Miss Genevieve Rousseau was perhaps 26 or 27, with auburn hair arranged in a soft Gibson girl style that framed a face of remarkable beauty. Her features held a refined delicacy, high cheekbones and expressive eyes the color of warm honey. She wore a modest but well-tailored dress of deep blue wool, with leg-of-mutton sleeves and a high collar trimmed in ivory lace. Despite the simplicity of her attire compared to the elaborate gowns of Boston society ladies, she carried herself with quiet grace. She scanned the room with intelligent eyes before they settled on Alexander. He stood immediately, his height commanding attention even in the spacious hall. As she approached, he noticed she carried a small leather satchel and walked with the posture of someone accustomed to moving through different social spheres without discomfort. Detective Hartford. Her voice was melodious, carrying the faintest trace of a French accent that added music to her English words. "I am Genevieve Rousseau. Miss Rousseau, thank you for coming." Alexander extended his hand, and when she placed her gloved fingers in his, he felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "Please do sit down." They settled into chairs across from each other, and Alexander found himself momentarily distracted by the way the afternoon light caught the copper highlights in her hair. He cleared his throat, forcing his mind back to business. "Mrs. Dawson spoke highly of your linguistic abilities," he began, keeping his tone professional. "I must confess I was skeptical that one person could possess fluency in so many languages. It's quite remarkable." Genevieve's lips curved in a slight smile. "My father was a diplomat, Detective Hartford. We moved throughout Europe during my childhood. Languages became a necessity, then a passion. I studied formally in Paris, Vienna, and Rome before circumstances brought me to America." Circumstances. Alexander's investigative instincts stirred. "My father passed away 2 years ago. My mother followed him within 6 months. I had no siblings, no close family remaining in Europe. A distant cousin in Boston offered me passage here, though her own situation proved less stable than anticipated." Genevieve spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "I found employment with the Blackwell family. They have 3 children who benefit from my knowledge of French and German. It's honest work, and I'm grateful for it." Alexander heard what she didn't say, the story of a gentlewoman fallen on hard times, forced to earn her living in ways her upbringing never anticipated. He understood such reversals of fortune occurred with tragic regularity, but something about Genevieve's dignified acceptance of her circumstances moved him. "I assure you the work I'm proposing would be considerably more stimulating than teaching nursery rhymes," he said, opening his portfolio. "Though I must stress the need for absolute discretion. The case involves a theft from the Museum of Fine Arts, items of considerable value. These letters have come into my possession through various channels. I believe they contain communications between the thieves, possibly discussing the location of the stolen artifacts or plans for their sale." Genevieve leaned forward, her interest visibly piqued. Her honey-colored eyes sparkled with intellectual curiosity. "May I examine them?" Alexander spread the letters across the table. Genevieve's slender fingers moved from one to the next, her expression growing more animated with each document she touched. She lifted the first letter, written in French, and began reading aloud in a soft voice, translating as she went. "My dear Anton, the packages arrived safely. The Italian is nervous, but I assure him the American buyer shows genuine interest. We must proceed carefully. The detective asks questions throughout the city. And it's dated 3 weeks ago, postmarked from New York." Alexander pulled out his notebook, writing quickly. "The Italian could be Giuseppe Marconi. He's a known dealer in questionable antiquities. But who is Anton?" Genevieve had already moved to the second letter, this one in German. Her pronunciation was flawless, the harsh consonants softened by her naturally musical voice. "Anton, you must calm yourself. The American detective is merely a rich man playing at work. He will tire of the chase soon enough. The Russian agrees we should wait until November for the final transaction. This one is signed with just an initial, V. V could be Viktor Volkov." Alexander mused, his mind racing. "He's been on my list of suspects, but I had no concrete evidence linking him to the case." For the next hour, they worked together in intense concentration. Genevieve translated each letter with remarkable speed and accuracy, occasionally explaining nuances of phrasing or cultural context that illuminated hidden meanings. The Italian letter discussed shipping routes. The Russian correspondence detailed a meeting location near the harbor. The Portuguese letter mentioned a buyer from South America. The Polish document, which proved to be the most cryptic, referenced the Winter Garden and When the Lights Shine Brightest. Alexander found himself increasingly captivated not just by the information being revealed, but by the woman revealing it. Genevieve's intelligence was evident in how she connected threads between the letters. suggesting interpretations he hadn't considered. Her education clearly extended far beyond language alone. She understood geography, art history, even the subtleties of criminal behavior. The Winter Garden, Genevieve said thoughtfully, tapping the Polish letter. Detective Hartford, could that be a reference to a specific location? In Europe, winter gardens are conservatories, glass structures where plants are kept during cold months. Alexander's eyes widened. The Horticultural Hall. It has an extensive conservatory, and they're hosting their annual chrysanthemum exhibition next month. When the lights shine brightest could mean the opening gala. It's one of Boston's major social events. A perfect cover for a transaction, Genevieve agreed. Hundreds of wealthy attendees, champagne flowing, everyone distracted by the flowers and festivities. Who would notice two men conducting business in a corner? Their eyes met across the table, and Alexander felt something shift in the space between them. It wasn't merely professional respect, though he certainly felt that. There was a spark of connection, an unspoken recognition that they worked together with unusual harmony. Genevieve seemed to sense it too, for a faint blush colored her porcelain cheeks before she looked down at the letters again. Miss Rousseau, Alexander said slowly, I wonder if I might impose upon you further. This information is invaluable, but I suspect there may be additional correspondence to intercept and translate. Would you consider consulting on this case more regularly? I would, of course, compensate you generously for your time. Genevieve was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Alexander could see her weighing considerations he could only guess at: propriety, opportunity, perhaps simple financial necessity. When she looked up, her honey eyes held both caution and interest. What exactly would such consultation entail, Detective Hartford? Evening meetings, perhaps twice a week, here at the library or another suitable public location. You would review any new documents I acquire and assist with translation. Possibly, if you're willing, I might ask your opinion on the case itself. Your insights today have been remarkably astute. He paused, then added with complete sincerity, I believe you have a natural talent for investigative work, Miss Rousseau. A genuine smile transformed her face, lighting her features with warmth. You cannot know how long it has been since someone asked my opinion on matters of substance, Detective. In my current position, my thoughts are sought only on whether young Master Timothy should practice his French verbs before or after tea. Then we have an arrangement? Alexander extended his hand again. Genevieve removed her glove before placing her bare hand in his, a gesture of trust that made his heart beat faster. Her skin was soft and warm, her grip firm. We do, Detective Hartford, though I must ask, what makes you trust me with such sensitive information? You know very little about me. Alexander held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing it. I'm an excellent judge of character, Miss Rousseau. It's essential in my profession. And I recognize integrity when I encounter it. They arranged to meet again on Tuesday evening, giving Alexander time to pursue leads based on the translated letters. As they gathered the documents and prepared to depart, a comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that suggested the beginning of understanding. Tuesday evening arrived with a chill that promised winter's early arrival. Alexander found himself checking his pocket watch repeatedly throughout the day, aware of an anticipation that had nothing to do with the case itself. He arrived at the library 20 minutes early, choosing the same corner table they had occupied on Sunday. The reading room held fewer patrons this evening, mostly students bent over thick textbooks and elderly gentlemen perusing newspapers. Genevieve arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, wrapped in a burgundy wool cloak that complemented her auburn hair beautifully. She carried her leather satchel and what appeared to be a small package wrapped in brown paper. Alexander stood immediately, and when their eyes met across the room, he saw her smile before she quickly composed her features into a more professional expression. Detective Hartford, she greeted him, settling into the chair he held for her. I hope you've had productive days since our last meeting. More productive than I anticipated thanks to your translations, Alexander replied, returning to his seat. I've been conducting surveillance on Victor Volkov and Giuseppe Marconi. Yesterday I observed them meeting at a cafe in the North End. They were joined by a third man I've identified as Wilhelm von Schmidt, a German art dealer with questionable credentials. Genevieve's eyes brightened with interest. The three primary correspondents from the letters, were you able to hear their conversation? Unfortunately, no. They spoke in low voices, and I couldn't position myself close enough without drawing attention. However, I did manage to follow von Schmidt afterward. He led me to a warehouse near the harbor, specifically on Long Wharf. The building is registered to a shipping company called Atlantic Maritime Ventures. Atlantic Maritime, Genevieve repeated thoughtfully. That was mentioned in the Portuguese letter, wasn't it? The one discussing South American buyers. Alexander nodded, impressed once again by her sharp memory. Exactly. I believe they're using the warehouse to store the stolen artifacts until the sale at the Horticultural Hall Gala, which presents us with a problem. The gala is 3 weeks away, November 15th. That's considerable time for them to move the items or change their plans if they suspect they're being watched. Then perhaps we shouldn't wait for the gala, Genevieve suggested. If you know where the artifacts are stored, couldn't you simply alert the authorities and have them raid the warehouse? Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. In theory, yes, but I lack concrete evidence. The letters alone won't convince a judge to issue a search warrant. They're not signed with full names, and a clever lawyer could argue they refer to legitimate business transactions. I need something more definitive, either photographic evidence of the stolen items inside the warehouse, or testimony from someone involved willing to turn informant. A difficult position, Genevieve said sympathetically. Then her expression grew thoughtful. What if there were another letter? Something more explicit that would provide the evidence you need? If only such a letter existed. I've exhausted my sources trying to intercept their correspondence. Alexander paused, studying her face. Miss Rousseau, you look as though you have an idea forming. She hesitated, and Alexander could see her weighing whether to voice whatever thought had occurred to her. Finally, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. What if we created such a letter? A forgery that would prompt them to respond in a way that reveals their guilt. Alexander felt his pulse quicken, though whether from the audacity of the suggestion or Genevieve's proximity, he couldn't say. You're proposing we send a false communication to provoke a genuine response? That's quite devious, Miss Rousseau. A slight smile played at her lips. I did mention I spent my formative years among diplomats, Detective. I learned that sometimes the most effective way to uncover truth is through strategic misdirection. She reached for the brown paper package she'd brought, which is why I took the liberty of bringing these. She unwrapped the package to reveal several sheets of aged stationery, bottles of ink in various colors, and examples of the handwriting from each of the translated letters, which she had apparently copied during their last meeting. Alexander stared at the materials, then at Genevieve, seeing her in an entirely new light. You came prepared to propose forgery, he said slowly. I came prepared to present an option for your consideration, she corrected gently. Whether we pursue it is entirely your decision, Detective Hartford. But I've been thinking about this case constantly since Sunday. Those artifacts belong to the museum, to the public. These men are thieves who profit from stealing cultural treasures. If unconventional methods are required to see justice done, I believe the risk is justified. Alexander found himself grinning despite the serious nature of their discussion. Miss Rousseau, you are full of surprises. Very well, let's explore this idea. What exactly did you have in mind? For the next hour, they plotted like co-conspirators. Genevieve proposed they forge a letter in German, supposedly from Wilhelm von Schmidt to Victor Volkov, expressing concern that the detective was getting too close and suggesting they move the artifacts immediately. The letter would indicate a specific time and date for the transfer, allowing Alexander to be present with a police photographer he trusted to document the stolen items. The key, Genevieve explained, carefully examining von Schmidt's handwriting sample, is to match not just the script, but the personality behind it. Von Schmidt writes with aggressive downstrokes and sharp angles. He's a man who likes to appear forceful, dominant. The letter must reflect that character, or Volkov will suspect deception. She selected a sheet of slightly yellowed stationery and began to write in German, her hand moving with confident strokes. Alexander watched, fascinated, as she transformed her naturally flowing script into von Schmidt's more aggressive style. She wrote quickly, barely pausing, as though the words flowed directly from von Schmidt's mind through her pen. When she finished, she slid the letter across the table to Alexander. He read her German text slowly, having studied the language at Harvard, though he lacked her fluency. The letter was perfect, conveying urgency without panic, concern without cowardice. It suggested moving the artifacts on Friday night, 3 days hence, to a secondary location in Cambridge. This is remarkable, Alexander said honestly. How did you learn to forge handwriting so convincingly? Genevieve's cheeks colored slightly. My father sometimes needed documents prepared quickly for diplomatic purposes. He taught me the skill when I was 16, insisting it was a useful talent for a diplomat's daughter. I never imagined I'd use it to catch art thieves in Boston. Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man. He was, Genevieve said softly, and Alexander saw genuine grief shadow her lovely features. He believed knowledge was the greatest inheritance he could provide me. I wish he could have known how right he was, how those skills would sustain me when fortune turned. Alexander felt a powerful urge to reach across the table and take her hand, to offer comfort, but they were in public and such familiarity would be improper. Instead, he said quietly, "I'm certain he would be immensely proud of the woman you've become, Miss Rousseau." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Alexander felt that spark of connection again, stronger this time. Genevieve was the first to look away, but not before he saw the warmth in her gaze that suggested she felt it too. "We should discuss logistics," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "How will you ensure the letter reaches Volkov? And won't von Schmidt deny sending it when Volkov inevitably questions him? I have a contact at the Postal Service who owes me a favor," Alexander explained. "He can ensure the letter is postmarked from New York, where von Schmidt supposedly is this week according to my sources. As for von Schmidt's denial, by the time Volkov reaches him to verify, we'll have already documented the artifacts and alerted the authorities. The confusion will work in our favor, making them panic and potentially make mistakes." They spent another 30 minutes refining their plan. Alexander would deliver the forged letter to his postal contact tomorrow morning. It would reach Volkov by Thursday, giving him just enough time to arrange the Friday night transfer. Alexander would position himself near the warehouse with Officer Patrick Brennan, a police photographer he trusted completely, to document everything. "I want to be there," Genevieve said suddenly. "Friday night at the warehouse. I want to see this through." Alexander shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. It could be dangerous. These men have already proven themselves criminals. If something goes wrong, then having another witness would be valuable," Genevieve interrupted, her chin lifting stubbornly. "Detective Hartford, I'm not a delicate flower who will faint at the first sign of trouble. I've contributed significantly to this investigation. I deserve to see its conclusion. Miss Rousseau, I don't question your courage or capability, but I would never forgive myself if you were harmed because of a case I brought you into. That decision should be mine to make, shouldn't it?" Her honey eyes flashed with determination. "You hired me as a consultant, not a subordinate. I'm asking to observe, nothing more. I'll stay in your automobile at a safe distance. You won't even know I'm there." Alexander studied her face, seeing the resolve there, recognizing that arguing further would be futile. More than that, he understood her need to be present, to see her contribution matter in a tangible way. How many years had she spent having her intelligence and capabilities overlooked, reduced to teaching children their alphabet when she could speak 6 languages and forge documents with criminal precision? "Very well," he conceded. "But you'll remain in the automobile with the doors locked, and if I signal any danger, you'll drive away immediately. Agreed?" "Agreed," Genevieve said, her smile returning. "Thank you for trusting me, Detective Hartford." "Alexander," he said impulsively. "When we're alone, please call me Alexander." She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Only if you'll call me Genevieve." "Genevieve," he repeated, liking how her name felt in his mouth. "It suits you, beautiful and uncommon." She blushed deeply this time, and Alexander realized he'd spoken more intimately than he'd intended. Yet he didn't regret it. Something was developing between them, something that went beyond professional collaboration. He'd felt it from their first meeting, that sense of recognition, as though he'd been waiting to meet her without knowing it. They parted outside the library as the evening bells tolled 7 o'clock. Alexander watched Genevieve walk toward the streetcar stop, her burgundy cloak bright against the darkening street. He wanted to offer his automobile, to drive her home properly, but such an offer might compromise her reputation. Instead, he waited until he saw her board the streetcar safely, before returning to his own vehicle. The next 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Alexander delivered the forged letter to his postal contact Wednesday morning, receiving confirmation it would reach Volkov by Thursday afternoon. He spent Wednesday evening planning their Friday surveillance, mapping escape routes and positioning points. Thursday, he met with Officer Brennan to explain the operation, swearing him to secrecy until they had photographic evidence. Thursday evening, Alexander sent a note to Genevieve at the Blackwell residence, confirming their plan. He suggested she tell her employers she'd be attending a church social Friday evening, providing a respectable excuse for her absence. Her return note was brief but warm, assuring him she'd made the necessary arrangements and would meet him at 6 o'clock Friday at the corner of Beacon and Charles Street. Friday arrived with heavy gray skies and the smell of approaching snow. Alexander spent the day in a state of controlled tension, triple-checking his equipment and reviewing every possible scenario. As evening approached, he dressed in dark, practical clothing rather than his usual fine suits. He loaded his revolver, a Colt police positive he rarely carried, and placed it in his coat pocket. He told himself it was merely precaution, but the weight of the weapon reminded him that they were dealing with criminals who would not surrender their prizes easily. He collected Genevieve precisely at 6. She wore a practical dark gray dress and a black cloak, her auburn hair pinned severely back. Even dressed for stealth rather than society, she was breathtaking. She climbed into his automobile with grace, settling beside him in the passenger seat. "Are you nervous?" Alexander asked as he guided the vehicle toward the harbor district. "Terrified," Genevieve admitted with surprising honesty, "but also exhilarated. Is that strange?" "Not at all. I feel exactly the same." He glanced at her, their eyes meeting briefly before he returned his attention to the road. "Thank you for this, Genevieve. For all of it. I couldn't have gotten this far without you. We make a good team," she said softly. "Perhaps we should consider making this arrangement permanent. A detective and his linguistic consultant. There must be other cases where such skills would prove valuable." Alexander's heart leaped at the suggestion, at the implied desire to continue working together, to continue seeing each other. "I would like that very much." They arrived at Long Wharf as darkness fully settled over the harbor. Alexander parked his automobile in the shadows between two warehouses, positioning it with a clear view of the Atlantic Maritime Ventures building, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. Officer Brennan arrived moments later in an unmarked carriage, his camera equipment concealed in a large case. "Remember," Alexander said to Genevieve, "doors locked, and if anything seems wrong, you drive away. The keys are in the ignition." She nodded, and he saw her hands trembling slightly despite her composed expression. Impulsively, he reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "It will be fine. We'll have our evidence and be gone before they even know we were here." Her fingers tightened around his. "Be careful, Alexander." The sound of his name on her lips sent warmth through his chest. He reluctantly released her hand and exited the automobile, joining Brennan in the shadows. They positioned themselves behind a stack of crates that offered both concealment and a view of the warehouse entrance. They waited. Minutes stretched like hours in the cold November darkness. Alexander's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. Beside him, Brennan checked his camera repeatedly, ensuring everything was ready. From their position, Alexander could just see Genevieve in the automobile, her pale face visible in the darkness. At precisely 8 o'clock, as the forged letter had specified, a carriage arrived. Victor Volkov emerged first, a bulky man in an expensive overcoat, his breath visible in the cold. Giuseppe Marconi followed, smaller and more nervous, his eyes darting around the dark wharf. They unlocked the warehouse and disappeared inside. Alexander held his breath as light bloomed inside the warehouse, visible through grimy windows high on the building's walls. He gestured to Brennan, and they moved closer, keeping to the shadows cast by stacked shipping crates and coiled rope. The November wind off the harbor cut through Alexander's coat, but he barely noticed, his entire focus on the warehouse before them. Through a partially open loading door, they could hear voices speaking in Russian. Volkov's deep baritone carried clearly in the night air, though Alexander couldn't understand the words. He wished desperately that Genevieve were beside him to translate, but immediately dismissed the thought. She was safer in the automobile, as they had agreed. Brennan nudged Alexander's arm and pointed. Through the gap in the loading door, they could see the two men moving deeper into the warehouse, carrying oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Alexander made a quick decision. If they wanted photographic evidence of the stolen artifacts, they needed to get closer, perhaps even inside the building. He turned to Brennan and whispered, "I'm going to circle around to the side entrance. There's a door I noticed during my earlier surveillance. It might be unlocked. You stay here with the camera ready. If I can get them to bring the artifacts near this loading door, you'll have your shot." Brennan nodded, his weathered face grim but determined. Alexander crept along the warehouse's perimeter, his boots silent on the damp cobblestones. The side door was indeed unlocked, its hinges creaking softly as he eased it open just enough to slip inside. The interior smelled of salt, old wood, and machine oil. Stacks of crates created a maze of narrow passages, and Alexander moved through them carefully, following the glow of the lamps and the sound of voices. He positioned himself behind a tower of wooden boxes, close enough now to observe Volkov and Marconi clearly. The Russian was prying open a large crate with a crowbar, his movements efficient and practiced. When the lid finally came free, both men peered inside, and Alexander heard Marconi's exclamation of satisfaction. Volkov reached into the crate and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a bronze sculpture that even in the dim lamplight was unmistakably ancient and valuable. Alexander recognized it immediately from the museum's inventory, a Grecian figure that had been part of their classical collection. His heart raced with triumph. This was exactly the evidence they needed. But then everything went wrong with terrifying speed. A sound echoed from near the main entrance, the unmistakable creak of the loading door opening wider. Volkov's head snapped up, his expression transforming from satisfaction to suspicion in an instant. He barked something in Russian, and Marconi immediately extinguished his lamp. Volkov did the same a moment later, plunging the warehouse into darkness broken only by faint moonlight filtering through the high windows. Alexander pressed himself against the crates, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver in his pocket. He heard rather than saw the two men moving, their footsteps deliberate and predatory. They were hunting, searching for whoever had disturbed them. Alexander's mind raced. Had Brennan accidentally revealed himself? Or had another party arrived? Perhaps Wilhelm von Schmidt, suspicious about the letter's authenticity. Then he heard it, a voice calling out in accented English that made his blood run cold. "Detective Hartford, are you in here? I heard something that sounded wrong." Genevieve. She had left the automobile despite his explicit instructions, drawn by concern when she'd seen something he hadn't. Alexander's protective instincts roared to life even as terror gripped his chest. These men were criminals, potentially dangerous, and Genevieve had just announced her presence and her connection to him. A woman. Marconi's voice came from the darkness, speaking English now. "The detective brings a woman to spy on us. How very American. More foolish than American," Volkov replied, his accent thick but his words clear. "Now we have leverage. Show yourself, Detective Hartford, or your lady friend will suffer for your cowardice." Alexander's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal himself, to protect Genevieve at any cost. But his rational mind knew that surrendering would only endanger them both more thoroughly. He needed to think, to find a way to turn this catastrophe into something survivable. He heard Genevieve's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a struggle, then her voice, angry rather than frightened. "Remove your hands from me immediately. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Despite the dire circumstances, Alexander felt a surge of admiration for her courage. She wasn't begging or crying, she was fighting. He began moving through the darkness, using the sounds of the confrontation to orient himself, circling around to approach from an unexpected angle. "Who we are dealing with?" Volkov laughed, the sound harsh. "A detective who plays at being clever and his translator. We know all about you, Miss Rousseau. Did you think we wouldn't investigate when Hartford suddenly gained the ability to read our correspondence? We have friends throughout this city, including among the staff at the library where you met so publicly." Alexander's blood ran colder. They had been watched, their meetings observed. The criminals had known about Genevieve's involvement from the beginning, which meant the forged letter, Alexander realized with sinking certainty, had likely been recognized as such. This entire night was a trap, and he had walked Genevieve directly into it. He rounded a stack of crates and finally saw them. Marconi held Genevieve's arm in a tight grip, though she stood with her chin high, refusing to show fear. Volkov stood nearby, a pistol now visible in his hand. The bronze sculpture lay on the ground beside the open crate, forgotten in the moment. "Detective Hartford," Volkov called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I know you can hear me. I'll count to 10. If you don't show yourself, I'll have Marconi hurt this pretty bird of yours. 1, 2, 3. Alexander's hand tightened on his own revolver. He was a decent shot, but in this darkness, at this distance, he couldn't guarantee hitting Volkov without risking Genevieve. He needed a distraction, something to shift the advantage. 4, 5, 6. Then Genevieve did something extraordinary. She began speaking in rapid Russian, her voice clear and commanding. Alexander didn't understand the words, but he understood their effect. Volkov's counting stopped. The Russian's head tilted, listening, and even in the poor light, Alexander could see surprise on his face. Genevieve continued speaking, her tone shifting from commanding to conversational, occasionally gesturing despite Marconi's grip on her arm. She was telling Volkov something, sharing information that clearly interested him. The Russian lowered his pistol slightly, drawn into whatever tale she was spinning. Alexander used the moment to creep closer, moving from shadow to shadow with practiced stealth. He could see Brennan's silhouette now near the loading door, the photographer apparently having entered when the situation deteriorated. Brennan met Alexander's eyes across the darkness and nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding they needed to coordinate their actions. Volkov was responding to Genevieve now, also in Russian, his tone questioning. She answered, and Alexander heard her voice catch slightly, as though overcome with emotion. Whatever story she was telling, it was affecting the hardened criminal. Marconi looked confused, unable to follow the Russian conversation, his grip on Genevieve loosening fractionally. Then Genevieve said something that made Volkov actually laugh, a genuine sound of surprised amusement. In that moment of distraction, Alexander moved. He stepped out from behind the crates, his revolver raised and aimed steadily at Volkov's chest. "Release her," Alexander commanded, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "It's over, Volkov. My associate has already photographed the stolen artifacts. The police are on their way. Surrender peacefully, and things will go easier for you." The Russian's amusement vanished, replaced by cold calculation. His pistol swung toward Alexander, and for a frozen instant, the warehouse held its breath. Then Brennan's camera flash exploded with blinding light, the magnesium powder igniting in a brilliant flare that illuminated every corner of the building. Volkov stumbled backward, temporarily blinded, his pistol discharging wildly toward the ceiling. The gunshot's report was deafening in the enclosed space. Genevieve moved with surprising speed, stomping down hard on Marconi's instep, while simultaneously twisting free of his grip. The Italian howled in pain, and she ran toward Alexander, her skirts hindering her movements but her determination undeniable. Alexander caught her with his free arm, pulling her behind him protectively while keeping his revolver trained on Volkov. "Don't be stupid," Alexander said coldly. "My finger is on the trigger. Make another move toward that pistol and I'll fire." Volkov's eyes, adjusting now from the flash, assessed the situation. He could see Alexander's steady aim, could hear running footsteps approaching from outside, multiple sets of boots on cobblestone. The police were indeed coming, alerted by the gunshot if nothing else. Slowly, with clear reluctance, Volkov raised his hands. "Very clever," the Russian said bitterly. "The woman distracted me with stories of her father, the diplomat who once worked with my uncle in St. Petersburg. She claimed you were coercing her, that she wanted to defect to our side for payment. I almost believed her." Alexander felt Genevieve trembling against his back. Whether from fear or the aftermath of adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "You're an excellent liar, Miss Rousseau," he said softly, meaning it as the highest compliment. "Learn from the best," she whispered back, her breath warm against his shoulder blade. "My father always said the most effective deceptions contain seeds of truth. There really was a connection between our families decades ago. I gambled that Volkov would know of it." The police burst through multiple entrances simultaneously, led by Officer Brennan, who had apparently gone for reinforcements when he'd first realized something was wrong. Within minutes, Volkov and Marconi were in custody, the warehouse secured, and the stolen artifacts being carefully catalogued. Detective Sergeant Murphy, a gruff Irishman who'd always treated Alexander's private investigations with skeptical tolerance, surveyed the scene with grudging approval. "I'll admit, Hartford, when your man Brennan came running with wild tales of art thieves and photographic evidence, I thought he'd lost his mind," Murphy said, examining the bronze sculpture. "But you've delivered exactly what you promised. These artifacts match the museum's missing inventory perfectly." "The credit belongs as much to Miss Rousseau as to me," Alexander said, his hand still resting protectively on Genevieve's shoulder. "Without her translations of their correspondence, we never would have located the warehouse." Murphy's bushy eyebrows rose as he looked at Genevieve with new interest. "A lady detective? Well, I've seen everything now. No offense intended, miss. None taken, Detective Sergeant, Genevieve replied with admirable composure, though Alexander could feel her still trembling slightly. Though I prefer to think of myself as a linguistic consultant rather than a detective. Call yourself whatever you like, miss. The department owes you its thanks. Murphy turned back to Alexander. We'll need formal statements from both of you, of course, but that can wait until tomorrow. You've had enough excitement for one evening. As the police processed the arrest and secured the evidence, Alexander guided Genevieve out of the warehouse and back toward his automobile. The November night seemed colder now, or perhaps it was simply the adrenaline leaving their systems. Genevieve's legs gave way as they reached the vehicle, and Alexander caught her, supporting her weight as she sagged against him. I apologize, she murmured. I seem to have used up all my courage for the evening. You have nothing to apologize for, Alexander said firmly, helping her into the passenger seat, though I'm still quite angry that you left the automobile when I specifically asked you not to. I saw Brennan move toward the warehouse entrance and trip over something. The noise seemed so loud in the quiet, and I was afraid he'd been spotted. I thought I could create a distraction, draw their attention. She looked up at him, her honey eyes luminous in the moonlight. It was foolish, I know. I nearly ruined everything. Alexander climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine before responding. As the automobile rumbled to life, he turned to face her fully. You saved us, Genevieve. Your quick thinking. That story you told Volkov, it gave me the opening I needed. You were magnificent. She smiled then, a genuine expression of pleasure at his praise. We saved each other, I think. That seems to be becoming our pattern. They drove through the dark streets of Boston in companionable silence for several minutes. Alexander's mind churned with everything that had happened, everything that could have gone wrong, how close they had come to disaster. But beneath the residual fear and relief, another emotion burned steadily, one he could no longer deny or dismiss. I need to tell you something, he said as they crossed into Beacon Hill, the familiar streets of his neighborhood emerging from the darkness. When I heard your voice in that warehouse, when I realized you were in danger, I felt a terror I've never experienced before. Not fear for my case or my reputation, but fear for you specifically, for your safety and well-being. Genevieve turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Alexander, please let me finish, he interrupted gently. I've spent my adult life investigating mysteries, solving puzzles, maintaining emotional distance from my work. But with you, from the moment you walked into that library reading room, distance has been impossible. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, Genevieve. Brilliant, courageous, kind, and I find myself caring for you in ways that go far beyond professional admiration. He pulled the automobile to a stop in front of his townhouse, turning off the engine before facing her fully. I know this is presumptuous. You're my employee, technically, and I have no right to speak of such feelings. But after tonight, after nearly losing you, I can't remain silent. I need you to know that you've become extraordinarily important to me. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Do you know what I thought when Marconi grabbed me in that warehouse? My first thought wasn't fear for myself. It was regret that I might never have the chance to tell you that I've fallen in love with you. Alexander Hartford. Alexander's breath caught in his throat, his heart seeming to stop entirely before resuming at double speed. The words he'd hoped to hear but never dared expect hung in the air between them, more precious than any artifact they'd recovered. In the dim glow of the street lamps filtering through the automobile windows, Genevieve's face was luminous, her honey-colored eyes reflecting both vulnerability and certainty. Genevieve, he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. Without thinking, acting purely on emotion for perhaps the first time in his carefully controlled life, Alexander reached across the space between them and cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was soft and cold from the November night, and he felt her tremble at his touch, though not from fear. I love you, she repeated, her voice stronger now. I've tried to maintain propriety, to remember my place as your employee, but tonight showed me how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change. I won't waste another moment pretending I don't feel what I feel. Alexander leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Genevieve met him halfway. Their lips touched in a kiss that was tender and passionate simultaneously, conveying weeks of restrained longing and newfound freedom. Her hands came up to rest against his chest, and he could feel her fingers clutching the fabric of his coat as though anchoring herself to him. When they finally separated, both breathless, Alexander pressed his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said impulsively, the words emerging before his rational mind could intervene. "I know it's too soon. I know we've known each other barely a month. But Genevieve, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me." She pulled back slightly, studying his face with an expression that mingled joy with hesitation. "Alexander, you're a wealthy man from one of Boston's finest families. I'm a nanny with no fortune, no connections, no family name to bring to a marriage. Your social circle can accept you or find themselves uninvited to my home," Alexander interrupted firmly. "I don't care about society's expectations, Genevieve. I care about spending my life with a woman who challenges my mind, who stands beside me in dangerous warehouses spinning tales to Russian criminals, who translates love letters from thieves and forges documents with diplomatic precision." He smiled, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I care about you. Only you." Tears sparkled in Genevieve's eyes, though her smile was radiant. "Then yes, Alexander Hartford, yes, I'll marry you. Though I suspect your housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, will be insufferably smug about having introduced us." Alexander laughed, the sound emerging from deep in his chest, full of relief and joy. "She'll dine out on that story for years, but I'll gladly endure her smugness if it means I get to wake up every morning beside you." They kissed again, longer this time, the November cold forgotten in the warmth they generated together. When they finally separated, practical considerations began asserting themselves. Alexander glanced at his pocket watch, noting with surprise that it was nearly midnight. "I should take you home," he said reluctantly. "The Blackwells will be worried about you." Genevieve's expression clouded slightly. "Actually, I need to speak with them tomorrow about my position. I can hardly continue as their nanny while planning a wedding and assisting you with investigations. It wouldn't be fair to the children, or to them. You don't have to work at all if you don't wish to," Alexander said carefully, not wanting to sound as though he was trying to control her choices. "Though I hope you'll continue consulting on my cases. You have a genuine talent for investigative work, and I meant what I said at the library. We make an excellent team." "I'd like that very much," Genevieve agreed. "Though perhaps we should establish an office, make it official. Hartford Investigations could become Hartford and Rousseau Investigations, or Hartford and Hartford, after the wedding." She blushed charmingly at her own boldness. "Hartford and Hartford," Alexander repeated, loving the sound of it. "We'll need proper business cards printed. But first, let's get you home before your reputation suffers irreparable damage from being seen in an automobile with a man at midnight." He drove her to the Blackwell residence in the South End, their hands linked across the seat between them, neither willing to break physical contact. When they arrived, Alexander insisted on walking her to the door despite her protests about propriety. "Let them gossip," he said, offering her his arm. "In a few weeks, everyone will know you're to be my wife. I won't hide my feelings or our engagement." At the door they shared one more kiss, brief but sweet, before Genevieve slipped inside. Alexander returned to his automobile feeling as though he were floating several inches above the ground. The dangerous adventure in the warehouse seemed like a distant memory compared to the overwhelming joy of Genevieve's acceptance. The following morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that seemed to match Alexander's mood. He was awake early despite the late night, too energized to sleep. After dressing with particular care in his finest day suit, he ate a quick breakfast while Mrs. Dawson fussed around him, clearly sensing something significant had occurred. "You're practically glowing, Mr. Alexander," she observed, pouring his coffee. "The case went well, I take it?" "The case was a complete success," Alexander confirmed. "The thieves are in custody, the artifacts recovered, and the museum is already planning a ceremony to thank everyone involved." He paused, then added with studied casualness, "Also, I proposed to Miss Rousseau last night, and she accepted." Mrs. Dawson's coffee pot clattered against the saucer, and her weathered face broke into a delighted smile. "Oh, Mr. Alexander, I knew it. I knew the moment I suggested you meet her that she was special. Wait until I tell my sister. A wedding at the Hartford estate, imagine. Let's not plan the entire celebration before I've even purchased a ring," Alexander laughed. "But yes, Mrs. Dawson, you were absolutely right about Miss Rousseau. She's extraordinary." His first task that morning was visiting the police station to provide his formal statement. Detective Sergeant Murphy received him in a cluttered office that smelled of tobacco and old coffee, taking detailed notes as Alexander recounted the previous night's events. Alexander carefully credited both Genevieve and Officer Brennan with essential contributions to the case's success. The stolen artifacts will be returned to the museum by week's end, Murphy informed him. The director, Mr. Ashford, specifically asked that you attend a small reception next Friday evening. He wants to thank you publicly for recovering their collection. You should bring Miss Rousseau. She deserves recognition, too. I'll extend the invitation, Alexander promised, already planning what he would say when he saw Genevieve later that day. His next stop was the finest jeweler on Newbury Street. The proprietor, Mr. Goldstein, was a distinguished gentleman who had served the Hartford family for 3 generations. Alexander explained that he needed an engagement ring, something elegant but not ostentatious, something that would suit a woman of refined taste and extraordinary intelligence. Mr. Goldstein showed him several options, but Alexander found himself drawn to a specific piece, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, set in white gold. The sapphire was the exact color of the deep blue dress Genevieve had worn to their first meeting at the library. Excellent choice, Mr. Hartford, Mr. Goldstein approved. The sapphire represents wisdom and nobility of spirit. It's a ring for a woman of substance. Alexander purchased the ring, arranging for it to be sized based on his estimate of Genevieve's finger. Mr. Goldstein promised to have it ready by Wednesday, giving Alexander time to plan a proper proposal, one more romantic than his impulsive declaration in the automobile. That afternoon, Alexander sent a note to Genevieve at the Blackwell residence, asking her to meet him at the Boston Public Library at 4 o'clock. He wanted to see her in the place where their partnership had begun, where they had first worked together, solving the mystery of the stolen artifacts. She arrived precisely on time, wearing a lovely dress of deep rose wool that brought color to her porcelain cheeks. Her auburn hair was arranged in soft waves, and her eyes lit up when she saw Alexander waiting at their usual corner table. I worried all morning that perhaps last night was a dream, Genevieve confessed as she sat down. That I'd wake up and discover none of it was real. Very real, Alexander assured her, taking her hand across the table, unconcerned with who might see. I've already informed Mrs. Dawson of our engagement. She's predictably delighted and already planning where to seat guests at the wedding breakfast. Genevieve laughed, the sound musical and free. I spoke with Mrs. Blackwell this morning. I gave her a month's notice explaining that I was engaged to be married. She was very gracious about it, though I think she was more impressed that I'd caught a thief than that I'd caught a husband. She asked if I'd consider teaching the children languages twice a week even after I leave, and I agreed. They're sweet children, and I'll miss them. You have a kind heart, Alexander said softly. It's one of the 1,000 things I love about you. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, when to announce their engagement formally, where they might live after the wedding, how to structure their investigative partnership. Genevieve had intelligent opinions on everything, and Alexander found himself revising his assumptions about how their life together would work. She wasn't content to be merely a wife, or even merely a consultant. She wanted to be a full partner, equal in every way. I was thinking, Genevieve said thoughtfully, that your townhouse is lovely, but it's very much a bachelor's residence. Perhaps we could look for a place that's ours together. Something with space for a proper office where we can work on cases, and perhaps a library for all the books I imagine we'll accumulate. I like that idea very much, Alexander agreed, though I warn you, I have several warehouses full of family belongings we'll need to sort through. The Hartfords have been accumulating possessions for 4 generations. Then we'll sort through them together, Genevieve said simply. That's what marriage means, doesn't it? Facing everything together, whether it's dangerous criminals or dusty attics. Over the following days, their engagement became the talk of Boston society. Alexander formally announced it in the newspaper, introducing Genevieve Rousseau as his fiancée and future business partner. The response was mixed. Some of Alexander's social circle welcomed Genevieve warmly, charmed by her beauty and intelligence. Others whispered about her lack of fortune and family connections, questioning whether she was marrying for money. Alexander addressed these whispers directly at a dinner party hosted by his cousin Margaret. When one particularly catty society matron made a veiled comment about fortune hunters, Alexander stood and spoke clearly enough for the entire table to hear. Miss Rousseau is the most brilliant woman I've ever met. She speaks 6 languages fluently, has solved criminal cases that baffled the police, and possesses more courage in her little finger than most men have in their entire bodies. She could have married any number of men for security alone, but she chose me. I consider myself the fortunate one in this arrangement, and anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to exit my presence permanently." The dinner party fell silent. Then Margaret began applauding, and others gradually joined in. The catty matron looked appropriately chastened, and after that evening, the whispers diminished considerably. The museum reception arrived on a crisp Friday evening in late November. The Museum of Fine Arts had arranged a private viewing of the recovered artifacts for a select group of donors and dignitaries. Alexander arrived with Genevieve on his arm, her engagement ring now prominently displayed on her left hand. She wore a stunning gown of midnight blue silk that Alexander had insisted on purchasing for the occasion, and she looked every inch the sophisticated lady she truly was. Museum Director Ashford greeted them personally, shaking Alexander's hand vigorously. "Detective Hartford, Miss Rousseau, on behalf of the museum and the city of Boston, thank you. These artifacts are irreplaceable pieces of cultural history. Your recovery of them is a service we can never adequately repay. Seeing them return to their proper home is payment enough," Alexander replied graciously, "though I must insist that Miss Rousseau receive equal credit. Without her linguistic skills, the investigation would never have succeeded." The director turned to Genevieve with genuine warmth. "Miss Rousseau, we've actually been discussing you at the museum. We're establishing a new department focused on international acquisitions and cultural exchange. We need someone who can communicate with collectors and museums throughout Europe, someone who understands both art and diplomacy. Would you consider joining our staff as our Director of International Relations?" Genevieve's eyes widened with surprise and pleasure. "Director Ashford, I'm honored beyond words. But I'm about to be married, and my husband and I are planning to work together on private investigations. The position would require only 3 days a week," Ashford explained. "The salary is quite generous, and we'd provide you with an office and assistant. I think you'd find the work rewarding, using your diplomatic background and language skills to bring great art to Boston." Alexander squeezed Genevieve's hand encouragingly. "It sounds like an extraordinary opportunity. You should consider it." "We could make it work," Genevieve said slowly, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. 3 days at the museum, 3 days on investigations with you, and Sundays for rest and church. Then it's settled," Alexander declared, "though you're going to be the busiest woman in Boston, darling." "I prefer busy to bored," Genevieve replied with a brilliant smile. "And I'll have you to come home to every evening. That makes any amount of work worthwhile." They spent the evening circulating through the reception, accepting congratulations on both their engagement and the successful case. Victor Volkov and Giuseppe Marconi had been formally charged with theft and would face trial in the new year. Wilhelm von Schmidt had fled to Europe, but warrants had been issued for his arrest. The stolen artifacts were displayed beautifully, each with a small plaque explaining its historical significance. As they stood before the bronze Grecian sculpture that had been at the center of their investigation, Genevieve leaned close to Alexander and whispered, "Do you remember that first afternoon at the library, when I translated the French letter and you looked at me as though I'd performed magic? I remember thinking you were the most fascinating woman I'd ever met." Alexander replied quietly, "I remember wanting to know everything about you, how you learned languages, where you'd traveled, what you thought about everything under the sun. And now you'll have a lifetime to ask those questions," Genevieve said softly. "A lifetime won't be nearly enough," Alexander murmured, "but it's a fine place to start." They were married on a brilliant December morning, just 3 weeks before Christmas. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Trinity Church in Copley Square, with sunlight streaming through the magnificent stained glass windows. Genevieve wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves, her auburn hair arranged with orange blossoms. She carried a bouquet of white roses and winter greenery, and when she walked down the aisle toward Alexander, he felt his eyes fill with tears at her beauty. The reception was held at Alexander's family estate in Brookline, the grand house decorated with evergreen boughs and white candles. Mrs. Dawson had outdone herself with the wedding breakfast, and guests danced to a small orchestra in the ballroom as snow began to fall outside the tall windows. During their first dance as husband and wife, Alexander pulled Genevieve close and whispered in her ear, "Happy Mrs. Hartford." Deliriously, she replied, her honey eyes sparkling with joy. though I keep expecting someone to pinpoint the moment this became my life. A few months ago, I was teaching children their alphabet. Now I'm dancing in a mansion with my husband, planning to start work at one of the finest museums in the country, and investigating mysteries in my spare time. It's almost too perfect to believe. Believe it, Alexander said firmly. You deserve every bit of happiness, Genevieve. You're brilliant and brave and kind, and I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring you never doubt how extraordinary you are. As they danced, Alexander reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A desperate detective without a translator, a nanny who spoke 6 languages, a case involving stolen artifacts and forged letters and dangerous confrontations in dark warehouses. Any single element might have led nowhere, but together they'd created a love story neither had anticipated. The following spring, Hartford and Hartford Investigations opened its doors in a handsome office on Tremont Street. The sign outside featured both their names in elegant gold lettering, and inside, they'd created a workspace that was both professional and comfortable. Genevieve's linguistic references lined one wall, while Alexander's investigative files occupied another. A large desk sat in the center where they could work together, and comfortable chairs near the fireplace provided space for interviewing clients. Their first official case as partners involved tracking down a missing heiress who had eloped with a European count of questionable nobility. Genevieve's ability to trace correspondence in 3 languages proved essential, and together they located the young woman in Montreal before her family's fortune could be compromised. Word of their success spread quickly through Boston society. By summer, they were handling multiple cases simultaneously: a stolen necklace, a fraudulent will, a missing person case that led them to New York City. Genevieve balanced her work at the museum with their investigations seamlessly, her intelligence and linguistic skills proving invaluable in both arenas. The museum director was delighted with her efforts, and she'd already negotiated the acquisition of several important pieces from European collectors. One warm evening in June, they sat in the garden of their new home in the Back Bay, a beautiful townhouse they'd purchased together and furnished to reflect both their tastes. Genevieve was reading through correspondence related to a potential museum acquisition, while Alexander reviewed notes on their current case. The air smelled of roses and honeysuckle, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Alexander," Genevieve said suddenly, setting down her letter, "I have something to tell you." He looked up immediately, sensing importance in her tone. "What is it, darling?" She smiled, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. "I saw Dr. Morrison today. He confirmed what I suspected. We're going to have a child, Alexander. In February." Joy exploded through Alexander's chest, so powerful it almost hurt. He set aside his notebook and moved to kneel beside Genevieve's chair, taking her hands in his. "Truly? We're going to be parents?" "Truly," she confirmed, tears of happiness sparkling in her eyes. "Are you pleased?" "Please doesn't begin to cover it," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "Genevieve, you've given me everything. Love, partnership, purpose, and now this. I'm the most fortunate man alive." He kissed her tenderly, then rested his hand over hers on her stomach, marveling at the life growing there. Their child would be raised in a home full of books and love, would learn languages from Genevieve and investigation from him, would know that intelligence and courage and kindness were the greatest inheritances anyone could receive. "We'll need to be more careful about which cases we take," Genevieve said practically, though her eyes still shone with tears. "No more confrontations in dark warehouses." "Agreed," Alexander said firmly, "though I suspect you'll be an even more formidable investigator as a mother. You'll have that much more reason to ensure justice is served and the world is made safer." As they sat together in their garden, watching the June evening deepen into night, Alexander thought back to that rainy October evening when he'd stood at his window, frustrated and alone, desperate for a translator. He'd thought he was looking for someone to help solve a case. Instead, he'd found the woman who would solve the mystery of his own heart, who would become his partner in every sense of the word, who would give his life meaning beyond wealth or reputation or professional success. Genevieve leaned her head against his shoulder, and Alexander wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the city, another mystery waited to be solved, another adventure beckoned. But for now, in this perfect moment, Alexander Hartford had everything he'd ever wanted, and more than he'd ever dared dream possible. Their story had begun with stolen artifacts and desperate circumstances, with letters in foreign languages and dangerous men in dark places. But it had become something far more precious, a testament to partnership, to love that transcended social expectations, to two souls recognizing each other across the boundaries of class and circumstance. The millionaire detective had indeed been desperate without a translator, but what he'd truly needed all along was her, Genevieve, the extraordinary woman who spoke 6 languages and had taught him the most important language of all, the language of the heart.